Folks hear me? Awesome. Here we are. We apologize for being a few minutes late. Want to make sure we got everyone in. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Tom Bonnier. I'm the CEO of Target Smart. For those of you who don't know Target Smart, we are a progressive and democratic data firm. We work with Democratic Party, a lot of the organizations and candidates and campaigns that you're going to hear from today. We work very closely with those folks and their data needs. So, again, I appreciate everyone coming. You're probably a little bit on panel overload at this point. I know this is the season in DC, not only for apparently snow, but for panels and postmortems. And so I appreciate you choosing ours. What we're going to be doing is sort of taking a look back, especially in an election like the election we had last week. There's a lot that you miss sometimes. And I've had that where I wake up in the morning and I realize, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that we won that race, and I just found out a week later. So there's a lot of sorting to do through the results. So the focus here is going to be looking back. It's going to be talking to the people who actually made it happen in the states, in the districts, and even some of the folks who won some of these races. So I'm super excited. We have 3 great panels. I promise this won't be death by PowerPoint. I only have a few slides. Like I get people in the room, I can't help myself in sharing a little bit of data, but not much. So the first panel, we're fortunate enough to have 2 members of Congress-elect joining us here today, who both happen to have flipped Trump districts, which is a pretty cool thing. So I'm going to take a couple minutes just real quick before we bring them out on stage and tell you a little bit about these districts, because you may know them, you may not, but like I think you'll be sort of amazed when you hear the sort of districts that Democrats are winning in, and when you hear from them about how they did it. I think it's important to understand what they were facing running these districts. So first we're going to talk about Oklahoma Congressional District 5, which is probably a district that most of y'all haven't spent a lot of time thinking about. I noticed network TV didn't spend any time thinking about it until they found out we won on election day. So this is just looking at the partisanship of the district. In traditional red-blue, there's a whole lot of red places, and outside of downtown Oklahoma City, there's not a lot of blue places in that district in terms of how it's performed in the past. In the past being the key indicator here. If you look at the history in past races, President Obama in 2012 won just over 40%. This is one of the rare districts that Secretary Clinton actually ran ahead of President Obama, getting 41.3%. And that's the first indicator that maybe something was going on there, but still a district that she lost by a pretty hefty margin. And then you'll see the congressional results here that we'll be talking more about. This is the history of those congressional results. Districts that, and I could draw these lines back a couple decades and it wouldn't look any different than this. A district that we were losing by 25, maybe 30 points for a very long time. But here we go in 2018 with a solid 1.4% margin. The first sign that maybe there was something happening there for those who didn't have access to other data inside the campaign, who probably had a much better sense of what was going on. It's the early vote. And looking at the early vote there, we saw in 2014, Democrats were only about a third of the electorate. In 2016, they went up to 38.7. In 2018, 45%. So you're seeing intensity, but early vote's not a huge share of the electorate in Oklahoma, so that's not something you can count on by itself. All right, let me talk about New Jersey Congressional District 2, and then I'm going to call our guests up. So this is the district. If you've been to the shore, there are some wonderful shore communities here, and there's a whole lot of red areas. Again, you've got blue areas around Atlantic City, blue areas in the western part of the district, but otherwise, when you're looking at least how national Democrats tend to perform, not great. When you look at the presidential results, this is one of those Obama-Trump districts. This is a district President Obama actually carried in 2012, but we talk about how things fell off for Democrats in 2016. This district was the kind of place where it was happening. It was those Obama-Trump voters that were critical. As we talked about 2018, how do we get them back? Well, we're going to hear from someone who did. And then the congressional result, and speaking with Congressman-elect Van Drew, that was informed they actually just finished counting votes at sometime around 2 in the morning here. That margin is somewhere between 8 and 10% actually, so it's even a bit wider than what we're showing here. And you see that history again, where you got a popular Republican congressman who was winning again by similar margins to what we saw in Oklahoma CD5. So, same thing in the early vote, where you actually did see this first sign of intensity where the vote was actually coming out. Again, New Jersey, not a huge share of the electorate, but it was something that was telling us that there was something positive happening there. So, with that, I'd like to bring our guests up. So, first, from Oklahoma 5, Kendra Horn. Let's say this for those of us in the room who work in Democratic organizations, she is one of us. She is someone I had the pleasure of working with in a campaign in 2014. She's been an activist in Oklahoma for a long time, so it's especially gratifying to see her now as a member-elect. So let's welcome Kendra Horn. And joining us from New Jersey, he's been a state senator, as I could say the same about Congresswoman-elect Kendra Horn. They're two of the hardest working people you are going to find in politics, and that's no joke. If you try to follow them around, going out, knocking doors, you're not going to find people who work harder. Congressman-elect Jeff Van Drew has been elected in one of the most difficult state legislative districts in New Jersey, year after year, by going out and working. If he did the same in this congressional race, we're happy to have him here. Congressman-elect Jeff Van Drew. Okay, so I've got to do something here. I've got to go back because I was looking at some of the numbers, and we see this. We see the history in New Jersey. We see the same history in Oklahoma. You see all of the red areas in both of these districts. I want to talk about two dates here. I want to talk about November 29th, 2017 and July 3rd, 2017. Those were the dates that both of you announced your candidacy for Congress. So really my question is, what were you thinking? Congresswoman, if you want to
Well, first of all, I think I started planning before July 3rd, otherwise it might have been rather difficult, but I think many people thought I might have lost my mind. But what I was thinking was I'd been watching this district as a constituent, as a member of this district, and seeing that we just didn't have a voice. Our whole congressional delegation was solidly Republican, pretty unresponsive to a lot of the shifting demographics of the district, and that was really important. And just to be clear about it, I mean, after the 2016 elections, I think a lot of people were waking up to what that meant for our communities. We had a lot of really serious issues happening in our district, growing crisis in education, crisis in health care because our state legislature hadn't accepted Medicaid expansion dollars. There were a lot of very real issues on the ground, and I had been working with women and some other people especially for the last few years, getting more women to run for office, and realized that I had to take my own advice. And while this seat may have looked, and it is pretty challenging still, I just believed in the power of talking to the community and saw that there was a pathway there, but it was going to take a lot of effort to get there. So I figured might as well, if not me, who, if not now, when. Yeah.
So my story is a little bit different. I was running for re-election for state senate, and we were waiting for the results to come in, and I got a call from a reporter, and he said, well, this is really exciting, what are you going to do? And it was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon on election day. The polls in New Jersey closed at 8 o'clock. So I said, what do you mean, what am I going to do? I'm going to sit here and wait till, the polls close and wait for the results to come in for state senate, and then hopefully I believe we will be celebrating. And we did. It all worked out fine. But he said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. The incumbent congressman decided he is going to retire. And he made his announcement on our election day, which was a bit unusual. So that gave us only, really a couple of weeks to think about it and decide that we're really going to do this. And And it was something that I thought about through the years on and off. And I'm a practicing dentist. I won't be a practicing dentist any longer. Was involved with my family and had kids and just lots of different responsibilities. So state senate and the state house was perfect for me because you can kind of do both if you're willing to work real hard. But literally, it just coincided. The time came that this was the time for me to run. I decided I wanted to do something different. I decided I'd give it a shot. I started a little bit late because you have to raise a lot of funds, but nevertheless, we actually won, and it was kind of an amazing and exciting process. I would say the other thing is too, it's an interesting district, and it's red, but it's not purely red, and it depends where you are. So I have Atlantic City in my district. Well, Atlantic City is not as red as many other parts are. Atlantic County is not, but some of my other counties could be in Oklahoma. And so we have such a mixture of people and ideas, it's really difficult working with everybody because there's so much diversity in ideas that you really have to work your way through it. It is the largest district geographically in the state of New Jersey. It's about 42% of the state. So that also makes it a real challenge driving around from one end to the other. Different people, different, a lot of driving, and it was a very interesting process. I think what really made me want to do it is I always believe that we can do better, and I've never been afraid of hard work. And while you don't win everyone as far as getting the job done, you keep trying over and over again. And we've been successful with some big projects and some serious problems in my district. It's a wonderful place. It's a beautiful place to vacation. For those that have heard of Cape May and Atlantic City and all those areas, beautiful areas, some of the most beautiful countryside, yet we have the lowest per capita income in the state. Kids counts, which is how you really estimate how your children are doing, we are the lowest in the state. So as beautiful as it is when people come in the summertime and in the spring and the fall, some of the greatest challenges socioeconomically that you can find. And we want to do better than that. We want people that are going to really work hard and push hard and try to do better than that. And finally, I would say, the big way, at least I found to do it, and I don't know how it was in your case, but is to be very nonpartisan and bipartisan. We can talk about that more later. If you just run out and say, I'm running in this district, and I want you to know I'm running as a Democrat. That's the most important thing is you ran because you're you, and because you're going to work hard and take care of people. And that's what people by and large believe with me. They know I don't care what party they are, I don't care where they're from. We're going to do everything, God willing, to try to make their situation better.
And if I might just add to that a little bit, I think that very much applies to my district as well, but there was also a sense that people were ready for a different kind of conversation. And it was a conversation about issues that were really important to us. So when we made that announcement in July, we had our kickoff, we made the announcement, we put it out there, we had our kickoff 10 days later, and at the kickoff, we packed the place that we had set for the kickoff. We had 350 plus people in 100-degree heat, and they just were overflowing. And the exciting thing about it wasn't the same people that always showed up. It was new people, young people. It was a real cross section. And some of my team who was already on board with me at the time had been involved in democratic politics and different things in the state for years. Remarked afterward, they said, for the past 20 years we could have stepped into any sort of event that with democratic politics in the state, known 3/4 of the room, and they said we didn't know most of the people in the room. So there was an energy and excitement, but it did have to do with change that needed to be made and real issues versus partisanship and that sort of ideological lanes that we previously put people in.
So let's talk about partisanship. The elephant in the room, President Trump, and that's not a, didn't mean it that way. By the way, there's great boxed water here. There was a national narrative that developed as people are, whether or not the 24/7 coverage is good or bad, we can debate, and we'll save that for another day. But there tends to be a who's up, who's down narrative. And for a while, there was a narrative nationally in this race that Democrats maybe were blowing it because they were making their races all about Trump. And there was this narrative or this, truism that in off-year elections, the president is on the ballot. And so I'm interested to hear from both of you about your experience in terms of, on one hand, what sort of presence you did see the president playing in your race at all, and on the other hand, what the themes were of your campaign that perhaps weren't about these national themes or weren't about the national conversation at that point, which had become pretty low level. Kendra.
Yeah. Well, the president didn't really enter into our conversation throughout the entire campaign. And that was one of the critical components. We were out talking to voters on a day-to-day basis, and what we were hearing about was not the president. It was about education. It was about healthcare. It was about their concerns in their communities. As many of you, I'm sure, saw, we had a massive teacher walkout in the spring, so education was loomed particularly large. And a lot of people I know understood that a lot of that was state-based issues, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of student loan debt and other concerns about programs that support our public schools. So education and healthcare. And we say education, healthcare, and then changing the way things work in Washington. We just kept our conversations to the conversations we were having on the doors and with people on the phones or wherever we were meeting them. And that really kept us out of that national narrative, because if we were to try to follow that, it's just like this ping pong, and that's not what people, when you got right down to it, were concerned about. And that really made a difference in the end, because we stayed incredibly focused on what mattered to the people of Oklahoma and the 5th District. And by doing that, it kept us out of that space that would have been a no-win space. And we pulled in new voices too, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit. That was one of the keys. But message discipline and staying focused on healthcare, education, and just changing the conversation and the way things work in Washington. And we also had a lot of community support, a lot of small dollar donors, and we got that buy-in from college students at $5 a month or things like that kept us at the local level, and that made a difference.
So it's all of that in our district. Now, we have a high percentage of senior citizens, so they're concerned, obviously, with Social Security, Medicare, and protecting it and making sure that it stays there. And my opponent had said that Social Security was a Ponzi scheme. So again, that was, we didn't really get into, we focused on what he said and what he thought. In my district, I can only speak for my district, it's always good to really focus on your opponent and not somebody else if you can help it. Didn't always get away with it, by the way. Some of the most fascinating conversations, we would sometimes, literally, I'd go up to somebody, I'd be at county fair and say, hi, I'm Jeff Van Drew, I'm running for United States Congress, blah, blah, blah. And usually a lot of people didn't kind of know me because I'm a state senator, but there would be the husband right there, the wife right there, and the husband would say, yeah, well, what are you going to do about Trump? And I said, well, what I'm going to do is, he's the president. When he's right and he does something I agree with, I'm going to agree with him. And when he's wrong, I'm going to stand up for my district and say that he's wrong and disagree. And so he would, and more than not, it seemed like more men were for Trump. I think that held out in our numbers too. More men were for Trump than women. And so, like, he would be like, I guess I can live with that, And the wife would be, no, just knock him down, man. Just whatever you can do, go after that Trump, And again, that's over-exaggeration to some degree, but they'd be that close, and they would disagree with each other. So it did come up. I always try to minimize it and always speak about, which is what I really believe in my heart, that it is more important how you deal with these issues, just like she said, than how you deal always with the political politics of it. But sometimes you just couldn't help it, and sometimes it would come up. Sometimes people would even ask me examples, how would you agree with them and when would you disagree with them? So, like, for example, I would say, well, some of the VA issues, I agree when he says we're just not treating our veterans, and we're not properly in the VA system, and we have to do much, much better about having some more local care. I won't go into all that, but he's right about that. I believe he's right about that. But I think he's terribly wrong about offshore drilling, which would just devastate our coastal communities, and I'm surrounded by water everywhere, and I said that's bad for everybody, and Republicans would agree with that. And that's, I think, the big trick in a red district is to prove to folks that you are running against a particularly bad Republican, to be really honest with you, so that they can feel like, oh, I'm still Republican, but this one I'm not voting for. And that can help an awful lot, and that can make a difference. And sometimes they will be willing to move over the line and do that. I will say, the last thing I'll say here is, you are living through an amazing phenomenon. I've been involved in politics since 1991, and I've seen a lot of ups and downs, and a lot of things happen, and impeachment proceedings and everything else. I've never seen anything in my lifetime quite like this. He is sucking the oxygen out of the room. I don't mean necessarily in a good way, but it is something like we've never seen before. You're living history.
So speaking of that, I've always been curious, and now that you're on your way to Washington, do you ever have nightmares about President Trump tweeting at you? Because I do. It's much more realistic for both of you.
Why are you planting those seeds in our heads?
Sorry.
Now I probably will.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
conjuring that up.
Yeah.
So moving on. I think back to the day after President Trump's inauguration, January 21st, you had millions of people taking to the streets in the women's marches. Certainly was effort in, there was a lot of work and organizing that went into it, but a lot of it was organic. You saw this at the March for Our Lives. You've seen this in other marches for science, for so on. As you say, the time that we're living in is unlike any that any of us, I think, have experienced. And I think of how potentially that impacted these races and your races, where on one hand you have a Democratic and progressive base that's very energized and very much wants to have an outlet, and we're looking towards this election. And on the other hand, if you look at the election results and you look at how Democrats won, and obviously it's still early in terms of what we know and don't know, but the independent voters were key. There were a lot of crossover. You don't win districts like these without getting crossover voters. So my question for both of you is, as your experience in your district with resistance orgs, as we call them, these new organizations, a lot of them new organizations, a lot of them organizations that have been around for a while, they're doing great work. How did you interact with them? And then how did you also interact with maybe other organizations that weren't traditional Democratic organizations?
So, I'm a moderate. I'm a middle-of-the-roader, and I know there are some folks here, I'm sure, that are progressives, some folks, I'm sure, all over the political spectrum. In some districts, moderates are important. The Democratic Party is a big tent, or it should be a big tent. And we have to remember there should be room for moderates, and there also should be room for those that are progressive, and that makes a better party. It was a little bit challenging in my district because my district basically is going to vote Republican. And in fact, one thing I want to bring up is in this election, while not only did usually the congressional candidates do well, local seats went Democrat, and county commissioner seats went not us. We lost some county commissioner boards. We lost local seats. Actually, the influence of Trump and red versus blue was very powerful. And what happened in our district, it almost became like flag football. So what happened is the Reds were really trying to beat the Blues, and a little bit you had to be careful that your personality, your individuality, didn't get lost in that, because that was a really big deal. And that was one of the harder parts of the election. They keep saying, so many people came up to me, and I don't know if this happened to you, but people came up to me and said, look, I really like you, I want to vote for you, I do think we need some change, I don't love Trump all the time, but quite frankly, I don't want to flip the House. I'm a Republican, and I don't want to flip the House. I think it's dangerous. So you'd have to explain to them, look, you're only one part, but that's a hard argument to have, and I'm always going to vote for what's true for our district, etc. And that made it certainly more challenging and more difficult. We didn't find in our district what other districts did find, especially in New Jersey, that everybody went along. And also there was a lot of ups and downs in the polling, depending on what the president was saying, what he was doing, what was happening with the caravan. Caravan, real big deal in our district. Nowhere near where we live. Doesn't affect them at all. We don't know why, but it was a real big deal. We talked about it every day. So all of those issues really come into count, and you have to be able to deal with all different kinds of people, and that was the problem. So when I started out, and it worked out fine, we won easy in the primary, I had a primary, and I ran against 3 other people. One was a farmer, and they were all people that were very progressive, and then an African-American lady and an African-American man who would have been the first dad to run. So they had powerful credentials in the Democratic Party. The weird thing is if they ran in the general election, and I don't hate to say it this way, but they wouldn't have made it. They just would not have made it in our district. So we tried to work on bringing everybody together. That didn't work. We had the primary. I won and explained to people that I would be representing everybody and that hopefully it would be a real chance to move forward. And the party came together. 99.9% of it. I mean, we got, almost 90%, I think, of Democrats voted for me in the end, which really helped, and everybody did come together. But then you had to go from the primary to the general election. So in the primary, everybody's trying to, again, just reality, push it to the left. And then in the general election, everybody's trying to push it to the right. And I always said, look, I always tell the truth. I'm staying in the middle where I always am. And I did.
Yeah, there are some similarities and some differences between our 2 experiences in districts. Because if you look at our district, the top piece, which is Oklahoma County, has about 90% of the population. So that's urban and suburban. The other 2 are much more rural. So that's one thing that really comes into play. And we've seen a lot of shifts. So when I sat down to look at this and to bring the team on board and consider whether there was a pathway there, it was not just about this initial piece of it, everybody excited, but where the pathway was. And what we've seen is a shift in demographics, but also in voter performance and turnout, and we knew that was going to be key, is bringing in some new voices. So there's not a lot of organized, what you call resistance, or what people call resistance, but what there is a shift of the conversation that's been happening. We've seen it with a number of pickups at the state legislative level in this district, and there are other things that we looked at, that including some state questions, right? Voters overwhelmingly in the last 2 cycles approved criminal justice reform measures, with up to 70% of the vote, especially in Oklahoma County. They voted to protect the separation of church and state, again, overwhelmingly. They voted this year for medical marijuana. So other indicators that the willingness to change the conversation, but you have to pull it out of that Democrat versus Republican, but what people care about. And so one of the things we did was begin to engage people who showed an interest. So in one of the suburbs that's been traditionally very heavily Republican, there was this amazing growth in the Democratic women. So it started off right after the 2016 elections with like 10 women. And then by the time we kicked it off, it was more than 200 members, people showing up on a monthly basis, up to 300 members. And this is a place where everybody used to whisper if they were progressive and think that nobody else around them. And then they woke up and realized, oh wait, we agree about these issues. And that even included some of the moderate Republicans, because the conversation had shifted so much further to the right. So the things we were talking about were not radical in any sense, but we were having to shift how we talked about them to a frame that people could understand. And again, I think it's authenticity, that you alluded to that, because I was never chasing somebody else's vision of what this district was or why I was running. It was always about what we knew to be right for the district and the people. I'm a 5th generation Oklahoman, so my why is that my parents always taught me, if you see a problem, you can't complain about it unless you're willing to get to work, and you roll up your sleeves and do the work to fix it. And that's always been sort of my driving factor. And so we pulled those groups in, right? The ones that were kind of nascent. They just wanted to make a difference, but they had no idea what they were doing or how to do it, right? So we built a really strong volunteer base. At the same time, we intentionally built this very diverse group of fellows, high school and college age people. We told these young people that you are important. And we built this group, and we had them throughout. And of course, as being young people, sometimes they're going to be there for a semester and then they're going to be gone. But it wasn't just about, hey, come knock doors for us. we included this educational component. So it was really about buy-in from the community and reaching out to other communities. We had, endorsements early on from everybody from labor. I had an early endorsement from AFL to the statewide LGBTQ advocacy organization. And we came out of we had a 6-way primary because everybody got excited. But in order to win in a district like this, well-meaning people jumped in without the understanding of what it takes to win in a district like this. So I think the combination is you got to build a good team, you got to have the right plan and understand the district, but you have to have a candidate that can relate to the voters, and that is really critical. So we were able to build that excitement by just inviting people into the process and doing something different than campaigns had ever done before, including modeling, building a good team. And in spite of the obstacles, and I was the big surprise of the election night, and everybody said, "How did you do it?" I said, "Well, exactly the way that we came to you and told you we were going to do it a year and a half ago. You just didn't believe that we could do it." And so we did it with a shoestring, but we did it with Oklahomans, and we pulled people in that might have been kind of on the margins, didn't necessarily. Excuse me. Hold on.
Water.
That's very good box water. You should try some. So we brought those people in, and that is really key.
Mm-hmm. So I sincerely appreciate your time here. I have one more question for both of you. You're both in Washington this week as freshmen.
Yeah.
As the new kids on the block. Thankfully, you have a lot of company. There were a lot of new members elected. So I would love to, as we leave you and let you get back to it, and we again sincerely appreciate your time and joining us. If you would mind sharing something in terms of your impression as you've been in the Capitol, as you've been that freshman, as you've been through this orientation, in terms of what has struck you about this whole process. Whether it's certainly a whirlwind from getting elected last week to rushing out to Washington and having a lot thrown at you, and then finally finding yourself on a Friday afternoon at a panel in a hotel somewhere in Washington, D.C. What sort of impressions have you been left with through this process?
Well, it's funny, we were just talking before, so you win the election, you're really tired. I mean, you really truly win these kind of elections. I mean, you're just like, you're burned out, you're tired, you were up late the night before. I don't think you got to bed till like 3 in the morning because some of our results came in slow, and it wasn't until about 10 o'clock that we could really declare 10:30, I think somewhere around there. And the next day, you're getting overnighted mail. Like, literally, that morning, I get up, and there's like, you have to be here, you've got to do this. And I'm like, whoa, just one day, you would have really liked to have off. So I guess the one impression is, got to be ready, man. You're right into it, right off the bat. There's like no rest for the weary. And that's fine. Thanksgiving will be great for that. Right? That's the one thing, it's immediate. The second thing I would notice is just, how big everything is. And I've served in the state Senate and the state House for 16 years, and that's a big deal and it's a big thing, but this can be seen as overwhelming, and what an honor it is. Through all that we're going and all the problems that we have, and I really mean this, and everybody should know this and feel it too, this is a great country. It's extraordinary that I am even there. I don't know how sometimes, I started out in my case as literally running for council, and then finally became the mayor, and finally became county commissioner, the only one in generations, again in our crazy neck of the woods. And people used to say, "Oh, someday you're going to be a congressman." And I thought, "Yeah, right." And what a great honor it is that it still can work. That somebody like her, can just put an organization together, use their brains, use their focus, use their passion, and win. It still works. It still happens sometimes. So what strikes me in all of this is that we, all of us that are there, who really do believe, and I do, in this country and what we do, have to keep that passion, have to keep that love for your constituents in your district, have to keep that focus and that vision, and have to really try to make change. And it's a huge bureaucracy, and it's not always going to be easy. And there are going to be human personalities that are going to enter into it. So for me, what it meant was everybody's been really lovely and nice, and it also means that it just trains me that I've got to be really focused and I've got to really work hard and really make sure that I always remember who I am and where I came from. That's what it means to me.
In this seat, I am actually in the whole state. With my election, I am the first Democratic woman to ever be elected to the U.S. Congress. The third woman ever in the state's history. And the thing that struck me on election night that really stood out to me, because it's always been important, representation matters. And we didn't just focus on the fact that, I'm a woman running, and it is historic and it is important. And I've got all of the qualifications. We can run those things down, and we built an organization and a campaign that, win, lose, or draw, I would have been proud of, because I know we put it all into it. But I looked around the group of people that were there with us, that had been there with us, and what I saw in that room on that evening was our whole community. It was young people, it was older people, it was all different backgrounds, ages, races, ethnicities, sexual and gender orientations, all of the spectrum of, I think I unplugged it. Okay, there we go. All of the spectrum of Oklahoma's 5th Congressional District was there. And, Jen, can you hear me? No, okay. It looked like our community. And that's the point. Because representation matters, because our experiences are different. And I think when it comes right down to it, I understood that we had something to offer, that I had something to offer to this process that would intentionally bring people together. Because fundamentally, when we sit down and talk to each other, we may disagree on policy, but we've got more in common than we have different. And if we're able to sit down and have those conversations, that's how we start to change policy, and that's how we start to change the world. And as quickly as everything happens, because it does, it's a whirlwind. I had like an hour's sleep, and then we were hit it. It really struck me when they took us onto the House floor this week. And we got to sit there and just take it in. The awesome responsibility that is being the voice for 700 plus thousand people. That it's an awesome responsibility to show up and do your dead level best, to do the best for the greatest number of people, and make sure that those people who haven't had voices before have them, that they know that they are important, so that when we continue to show up in the community, everybody feels like they're at the table. And so that's what continues to strike me, and it just keeps driving, and I think that's what pushed us over the edge. People can see that, why you're showing up, but you have to be authentic about it, and I'm honored to be on this journey.
It's a great place to leave it. So thank you both so much for your work.